This is SpaceTime Series 27, Episode 67, for broadcast on the 3rd of June 2024. Coming up on SpaceTime, it seems last month's powerful solar storms have returned, the next test flight for the world's biggest rocket slated for June the 5th, and astronomy shown to be set in standing stone. All that and more coming up on SpaceTime.
Welcome to SpaceTime with Stuart Gary.
That spectacular sunspot region, which triggered some of the most violent solar storm activity in decades, has returned. After disappearing around the southwest limb of the Sun 2 weeks ago, active region AR3664, now newly renumbered as AR3697, is back, and it's brought more geomagnetic storms with it. It announced its return with a spectacular X2.8 class solar flare, followed by a coronal mass ejection, which luckily wasn't facing the Earth. A comparison of AR3664 as it revolved around the far side of the Sun and its reappearance into view off the southeast limb of the Sun shows that it has shrunk in size, but still retains significant magnetic complexity, with coronal loops and solar flares erupting almost continuously, producing numerous C and M-class solar flares, as well as at least 2 X-class events. The violence exhibited by the Sun during the first 4 years of the current solar cycle is already rivaling the level of solar flare activity experienced throughout the entire 11 years of the last solar cycle. And remember, we still have 7 years to go in this one. Solar flares are energetic eruptions of electromagnetic radiation from the Sun's surface. They're generated by magnetic field lines deep inside the Sun, passing through the Sun's visible surface, in the process producing sunspots, slightly darker regions of the Sun caused by the magnetic field lines dropping local temperatures. These field lines then loop out into space before returning to below the solar surface. As different latitudes of the Sun rotate at different rates, these magnetic field lines become twisted, eventually snapping and reconnecting, in the process releasing huge amounts of energy. As the solar flare erupts, it can also drag billions of tons of plasma and magnetic field from the Sun with it in the form of a coronal mass ejection, or CME. Solar flares are categorized according to their strength, similar to the Richter scale used for earthquakes. The smallest ones are B-class, followed by C's and then M, with X being the largest. Each letter represents a 10-fold increase in energy output. So, an X-class solar flare is 10 times stronger than an M-class flare and 100 times stronger than a C-class. Within each letter class, there's also a finest scale from 1 to 9. C-class flares are usually too weak to noticeably affect the Earth, but M-class flares do cause radio blackouts and minor radiation storms that can endanger astronauts. Although X is the last letter, there are solar flares 10 times more powerful than an X1 class, so the X-class flares can go higher than a 9. X-class flares can fry satellite electronics, they can cut off communications and navigation systems, trigger power grid blackouts on the Earth's surface, and cause the planet's atmosphere to wobble like jello, increasing atmospheric drag on spacecraft and forcing them to use up more fuel to prevent orbital decay. But they also trigger the stunning auroral displays, the aurora borealis and aurora australis, the northern and southern lights. Last month's geomagnetic storms were the strongest since the Halloween storms of 2003. Between May the 3rd and May the 9th, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory recorded no less than 82 notable solar flare events. They were spawned by 2 active regions on the Sun, 3663 and the far more violent 3664, clusters of sunspots which grew so complex that they erupted repeatedly for a full week. They also triggered at least 7 coronal mass ejections aimed directly at the Earth, and spaceweather.com is now reporting that they may have produced the most powerful auroral display in 500 years. The vivid auroral curtains of colour were seen as far south as Mexico and the Bahamas, and as far north as Adelaide and Perth. In fact, the storms were so intense that the U.S. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, which forecasts solar storms and their impacts on our planet, issued a storm warning for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And NASA preemptively shut down science instruments on several spacecraft and placed at least one into safe mode, just to be sure. Whether we're in for the same experience over the next 2 weeks, only time will tell, but we'll keep you informed. This is Space Time. Still to come, the next test flight for the world's biggest rocket now set down for June the 5th, and the archaeological studies which show astronomy is set in stone. All that and more still to come on Space Time. SpaceX says Starship, the world's largest and most powerful rocket, is now likely to undertake its next test flight on June the 5th. The flight from the company's starbase in Boca Chica, Texas, will follow a similar trajectory to the last 3 missions, with a Super Heavy booster stage programmed to undertake a controlled landing in the water, while the upper stage Starship section will attempt to achieve orbit and eventually a controlled re-entry and soft splashdown landing in the Indian Ocean. Success of this 4th test mission is vital for NASA's plans to return humans to the lunar surface in 2026 aboard the Artemis 3 mission. That's because a modified version of Starship called the HLS will dock with the Orion Artemis 3 capsule in lunar orbit and transport 2 of the Artemis crew members down to the lunar surface for what's expected to be a week-long stay near the moon's south pole before returning them to the orbiting capsule for the return journey to Earth. However, all 3 previous test flights have ended in Starship's destruction as part of SpaceX's rapid trial and error approach to development. The 3rd test flight back in March came close to achieving its goals, with the Starship reaching orbit and flying halfway around the world, only to be destroyed during atmospheric re-entry over the Indian Ocean. And Starship's also important to SpaceX boss Elon Musk. He developed the 121-metre-tall stainless steel spacecraft as a colonial transport system designed to eventually replace the current Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launch vehicles, as well as the Dragon capsules, with a new reusable spacecraft capable of carrying up to 100 people or 150 tons of supplies on missions to the Moon, Mars and beyond. You see, Musk wants the human race to become a 2-planetary species by providing a second home on another world, just in case. The Super Heavy booster is the world's most powerful rocket, producing some 16.7 million pounds of thrust. That's almost double that of the world's second most powerful rocket, NASA's SLS Space Launch System Moon rocket, which are used to transport the Orion spacecraft used on the Artemis missions. This is Space Time. Still to come, archaeologists prove astronomy is set in stone, and later in the science report, a new study has shown that the COVID-19 vaccine currently available in Australia is still effective. All that and more still to come on Space Time. Back in 2017, scientists with the University of Adelaide were, for the first time ever, able to statistically prove that the earliest standing stone monuments in Britain, the Great Circles, were constructed specifically in line with movements of the sun and moon some 5,000 years ago. The research, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports, changed archaeology's understanding of these great ancient monoliths forever. The study's authors used innovative 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional technology to construct quantitative tests of the patterns of alignments of the standing stones. The project's leader, Gail Higginbottom, said at the time that nobody before this had ever statistically determined that a single stone circle structure was constructed with astronomical phenomena in mind. See, up until then, it was all just supposition. The authors examined the oldest great stone circles in Scotland, Callanish on the Isle of Lewis and Stenness on the Isle of Orkney, both of which predate Stonehenge's standing stones by at least 500 years. Higginbottom and colleagues found a great concentration of alignments in the standing stones towards the sun and moon at different times of their cycles. And 2,000 years later in Scotland, much similar monuments were still being built that had at least one of the same astronomical alignments found at the Great Circles. The stones, however, were not just connected with the sun and moon. The authors found a complex relationship between the alignment of the stones, the surrounding landscape and horizon, and the movements of the sun and moon across that landscape. Higginbottom described the research as finally proving that the ancient Britons connected the earth to the sky with their earlier standing stones, and that this practice continued in some way for at least 2,000 years. While examining the sites in detail, the authors found at least half of them were surrounded by one landscape pattern and the other half by a complete reverse landscape pattern. And these chosen surroundings would have influenced the way the sun and the moon were seen, especially in the timing of their rising and setting, like when the moon appears at its most northerly position on the horizon, which only happens every 18.6 years. The authors found that for half the sites, the northern horizon is relatively higher and closer than the southern horizon, and the summer solstice sun tends to rise out of the highest peak in the north. At the same time, at the other half of the sites, the southern horizon is higher and closer than the northern horizon, and the winter solstice sun rises out of these highest horizons. Higginbottom says it's clear that these people chose to erect these great stones very precisely within the landscape and in relation to the astronomy they knew. She says they invested a tremendous amount of effort and work to do so, and this tells us about their strong connection with the environment and how important it must have been to them for their culture and for their culture's survival.
Certainly as far as individual statistical evidence for individual circles as opposed to looking at groups of circles, for example, this is the first time that we've actually been able to confirm that individual circles have a complex array of orientations regarding different parts of the solar and lunar cycles. And part of the reason for that is that when people were looking at the stone circles previously, they used to look at just the orientations that they thought hit on the sun or the moon, and they ignored those that didn't. So even if they tried to do some kind of assessment on it, they weren't approaching it in a very fully sound manner. So now we can conclude that we've done that, and we've got excellent results where both the Circle of Callanish, which is on the west coast and the Isle of Lewis of Scotland, and Orkney, the stone circle there, Stennes, most certainly, say 97.7% sure that they are set up in regards to astronomical phenomena.
And how did you do the research?
So we had two approaches. The first one was we had to do a very specific statistical test that was developed by my colleague Roger Clay.
Well, we're dealing with something that was 5,000 years ago when these things were first set up. So obviously the sky was different then. You had to account for all that. And
Absolutely.
and also the landscape, although the hills were there, nevertheless, the landscape may have appeared different in terms of vegetation and that sort of thing. All these sort of things need to be considered as well. So what did you basically do?
Yes, so first, of course, we did run our programs to ensure that we knew exactly where the sun and the moon were rising and setting at the times that these stones have been shown to be erected, as scientific dating has shown for them to be erected. And then on top of that, we looked at or examined the possibility of the vegetation cover in the areas. And basically, certainly for Western Scotland, it was shown that there was either very, very open, kind of like a scrubland equivalent, and partial, very, very open, basically, particularly on Western Lewis. Very, very open, and Western Scotland generally. And on Orkney, during that time, it would have been much the same. So when there were trees, it was very open, or sometimes just open patches in these two particular areas, and we've looked at other areas individually.
Is it difficult to put a date on these things? You can't use carbon dating for stone, I guess, so you're looking at something which is buried somewhere near it, I guess, that is carbon, or how did you do it?
A gentleman by the name of Patrick Ashmore did excavation of Callanish, and they looked at the different times that specific stones were erected or not, and other activities around the stone circle. So they confirmed that the different kinds of dating you do are through burnt material, so for example wood, or bone. And both have been found at Stennes and Callanish.
That gave scientists a pretty good idea of when these things were erected. I guess the fact that
Yeah.
we're seeing these sorts of stone circles throughout what we now call the British Isles, but also we've seen them in parts of Europe as well. Are we looking at, and I know this isn't your specific area of expertise, but are we looking at something which was a fairly, literally a broad church, I guess, something that was practiced over a wide area?
Certainly standing stone monuments were placed over a wide area, right from Ireland until Eastern Europe and beyond, in fact. India, China, other places, right through at slightly different times. Standing stone circles, though, are certainly not as prevalent as perhaps stone rows or single standing stones. And stone circles are most prevalent in the British Isles, Western Europe, Spain, Portugal, a few in Scandinavia, no firm confirmed circles in Germany, but lots of standing stones. The circles tend to be part of a burial monument as opposed to a separate standing stone circle. But there are great patches through the European continent where people chose to continue building their monuments in wood and earth. So there's a very interesting division there between the groups of people who adopted the megalithic culture and those who didn't. We're actually starting to look into that now.
Does it go with trade?
Good. Interesting question. I think that in the very, very early days of when, for example, agriculture was first coming in through Europe, I think that that is a possibility. I think it would have been trade, but also the movement of peoples, because sometimes people brought this different and the new, as it's called the Neolithic, sort of agriculture and the new Stone Age coming through parts of Europe, such as southeastern Europe and moving through Central Europe. And other times it was trade, so it would have been a combination. Nothing simple, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'd like to say it was simple,
Sure.
but it's not.
Seldom is,
and particularly,
unfortunately.
yes, yeah, exactly. We like to try and keep it simple, but then reality overtakes us.
Yeah, there's always caveats in any sort of research.
Absolutely, I agree with you fully there.
What got you interested in this?
What got me most interested in it was when I first saw a very tiny article in Scientific American many years ago on the standing stones of Scotland, or one in particular. And my colleague said to me, why don't you do this for your PhD? Maybe you could really solve some of the issues. So it all began there, and I have been addicted to it ever since, moving through from monument to monument and place to place across Scotland and branching out now through the British Isles and parts of Europe to see whether or not how much there is a connection between the peoples and culturally of those who are using standing stones.
There's been a lot of work in Australia recently looking at Aboriginal astronomy and the role that the night skies played in Aboriginal culture. And one thing I've seen by looking at that is that it simply mirrors what's happening everywhere else in the world. Is that what you're seeing when you look back at the 5,000-year-old culture you're seeing in Stone Age Britain?
If you're certainly referring to the idea that people were closely wedded to the night sky and the day sky as well, I would say absolutely. That the sky itself, in different ways, of course, because the Indigenous people of Australia often looked at the dark spaces in between the bright white lights, so to speak, and they had their shapes and their dream time connected to these identities, and they then mirrored what happened to them in their dream time on Earth as well. And overseas, ethnographically, you have very similar models, but with constellations. And I think that in ancient times that people were very closely, or prehistoric times, were very, very closely connected to their landscape. They had to be, because it was a life and death situation and it was their full-time living space. You pay attention to what's going on if you're living in it.
Is it just for agricultural purposes, or is there more to it than that? All we really have are the stones. There's no written work associated with this. What do you surmise from what you've done?
I think there are two very important things going on, and they're both tightly entwined. And that is, I think that the standing stones are in places that people already knew about, but at these places, and I'll explain this because it's something that we haven't really touched on, is that the standing stones in Britain at least are in very specific places we've discovered which allow you to view the sun and the moon from very specific perspectives. So for instance, you can at half the site see one perspective, and loosely speaking, and the other half of the site's another perspective. And so the first perspective is that when you're standing at your stone circle, that you will have the northern horizon very high and quite close to you relatively. The south will be very distant and low compared to the north. The summer solstice sun will rise out of the highest peak in the northeast out of this range or hillock or mountain, depending on the landscape, and set in the high mountain in the northwest. If you turn south, the winter solstice sun will rise and set out of little hills, or they could be mountains at a great distance, from the southeast and set into a hill in the southwest. And often it will travel over water to do so. And so you have all these amazing setups that they've done that can only be viewed at these specific locations. And what we discovered that for scores of sites in Western Scotland, which are Bronze Age, about 1500 BC, so that's about 3,500 years ago. And we now know those two great circles we talked about at the beginning have the same setup. And so, to get back to your question, therefore, that they know about these places already, so I don't think that they're already agricultural, because as soon as they built standing stones, they already knew about those places before agriculture had come. Agriculture was coming into that area around the same time. They were mainly herders, but they did do some agriculture, but it wasn't as big as it was down south, so to speak. Added to that, then, I think that what they've done is actually represent their cosmological understanding of the universe, and through these standing stones and how they see the sunrise and set out of those very special setups that they've done, they're showing themselves, and it represents the cycle that they understand that the universe works as a cycle, and that there is a cycle themselves work as opposition. So you've got day and night, the sun rising in the north, for example, at summer solstice, the full moon that can only rise in the south at the summer solstice if it's at its most extreme rising and setting point, which only occurs every 18.6 years, and all these kind of complicated things go on. Enough information, in fact, that they could even, if they wanted to, predict eclipses if they knew about that sort of thing. So there's more to it than just the Neolithic.
It's a very detailed culture, isn't it?
It is very detailed and very complex. Very complex. And it's also linked to the cult of the dead, because you will always find the dead associated with standing stones.
That was my next question. Are there burial sites nearby? So I guess you've just answered that.
Yes, and in very, very different ways. When they're associated directly with the standing stones, they're very frequently cremated dead. And you get parts of people's bodies placed, cremated bones that is, placed in the socket of the standing stone. So they put them in before they put the people in, or parts of them, before they put the standing stone there. And then they may also put a cremated burial inside a jar and bury that next to the standing stone. Or it may in fact be next to where they bury the cremation in a stone slab coffin underneath the ground and put a nice stone monument over that, a ray of a cairn, we call it.
Yep.
So the dead are associated in many different ways with these standing stones, and Stonehenge itself is known to have many, many dead associated with it.
With some standing stones, I believe there's also evidence of festivals associated with that, animal bones, things like that.
Oh, yes, we've got something very similar also happened at Stannis. So certainly nearby there may have actually been major festivals occurring, whether that's in association with the dead or not as well, I'm unsure, but they've also found bones that are associated with specific seasons in relation to the areas near Stonehenge. And they've decided they may well have been the special gathering times that people met together for either trade or other kinds of connections between groups across a large area.
That's Gail Higginbottom from the University of Adelaide. And this is Space Time. And time now to take a brief look at some of the other stories making news in science this week with a science report. A new study has shown that the COVID-19 vaccines currently available in Australia are still effective, especially against hospitalization and death. But the study also points out that their effectiveness has dropped as new variants appear. The report in the New England Journal of Medicine compared COVID-19 outcomes in about 1.8 million people across the United States, about 12% of whom had been boosted with one of the newer vaccines, targeting the subvariant XBB 1.5, which is also the vaccine currently preferred in Australia. Comparing with the general population, which includes unvaccinated people and people vaccinated with earlier versions of the vaccines, researchers calculated that XBB 1.5 vaccines were 52.2% effective against symptomatic infection after 4 weeks. But that went down to 32.6% and 20.4% at 10 and 20 weeks respectively. The authors also found effectiveness against hospitalization at 4 and 10 weeks respectively was 66.8 and 57.1%. And effectiveness against death was higher, but less certain because there were very few deaths. They say that over the course of the study, effectiveness appeared to reduce somewhat as newer non-XBB 1.5 variants began spreading. The World Health Organization's official figures suggest that over 7 million people have now been killed by the COVID-19 coronavirus since it was first detected among workers at China's Wuhan Institute of Virology back in September 2019. But the World Health Organization estimates that the true death toll of COVID-19 is likely to be more than 18 million, with some 776 million confirmed cases globally. After some 128 years of exploration and fossil excavations, Flinders University paleontologists have finally uncovered the skull of Australia's giant goose, Genyornis newtoni. The only previously known skull for this megafauna species, reported back in 1913, was heavily damaged and with very little of the original bone remaining. A report in the journal Historical Biology claims the new fossils, excavated from the saline dry beds of Lake Callabonna in a remote region of inland South Australia, have helped scientists reveal what the species really look like. It was a heavily built bird, over 2 meters tall, but with tiny wings and massive hind legs. An Iranian politician claims the Islamic Republic has now developed its first nuclear weapons. Lawmaker Ahmed Bakshayesh Artistani has told the Iranian-backed news outlet Ruyadat 24 that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards are keeping the development of the Iranian nuclear bomb a secret for the moment. Artistani, who was re-elected to Iran's quasi-parliament in March, claimed that Tehran needed atomic bombs in order to match the United States and Israel. Iran has broken its 2015 non-nuclear proliferation treaty on many occasions and has repeatedly prevented UN Atomic Energy Agency weapons inspectors from accessing suspected atomic weapon sites. United States President Joe Biden hasn't commented on the announcement. Back in 2015, the Obama administration handed Tehran $150 billion, which had been frozen by sanctions imposed to impede Iran's nuclear program. And then last year, Biden freed $16 billion for Tehran, including $10 billion frozen in Iraq and a further $6 billion which had been frozen in Qatar. The Heritage Foundation Center for National Defense says it was that funding which released money that likely contributed to Tehran's support for the Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists who invaded Israel on October the 7th last year, triggering the current crisis in Gaza. During the height of the Cold War, the CIA ran tests on people supposedly with paranormal abilities in an effort to try and gain an advantage over the Soviet Union, who were carrying out similar tests. The CIA's so-called Stargate project sounds more like an episode of Get Smart, testing ideas like remote viewing, in which a spy seeing a secret enemy site would use extrasensory perception, or ESP, to try and pass on that information simply through thought to fellow agents, without the need of shoe phones, cameras, radios, or other electronic communication devices. Tim Mendham from Australian Skeptic says it was one of many crazy ideas the spy agencies were looking at.
To me, I think it's perfectly justified. If you're in the CIA, your responsibility would be to use any tool you can get to try and gain an advantage in the spy world, in the military world. So naturally, you'd try anything and everything. And you've got a lot of money, so you can throw the money at these things to see if they actually work. So when people say, oh, look, the CIA invested psychic powers, you say, yes, they also investigated dolphins with minds attached to them and all sorts of different things, and they try anything. So, yes, They looked at psychics as they would.
They used
It doesn't-
LSD. They
Yes.
tried basically everything to see what would work, and if it didn't work, they dismissed it and moved on
They
to the
stopped
next.
doing it. They stopped doing it, and they did this exactly with the psychics. So, I mean, it was Stargate Project, it was called. It was using people from, at some stages anyway, using people from Stanford Research Institute, SRI, which was separated from Stanford University, used to be associated with it until they were doing things with the military, and then Stanford Uni said, no, we don't want you to be part of us, you go off and be a private thing. And a couple of researchers there in particular, who was Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, that the famous skeptic James Randi cruelly referred to as the Laurel and Hardy of parapsychology. They were doing things on various, I think they did it on Uri Geller tests, especially for remote viewing, which is seeing things from a distance, which would be pretty useful in a military sense if you can see what the other side is doing over the hill. So they're researching these things for a long time. It's part of the field of parapsychology, which is the investigation of paranormal, especially psychic powers. They're going on since the development of the British Psychic Association, Psychic Society in the 1800s, who have this as their aim to investigate scientifically these sort of things. And there's very little has come out of it that's reliable. And very little might be an overstatement. That has reliably come out of these investigations done by different laboratories in different places in the world, and some of them were shown to be, their research projects were shown to be unsound by the numbers of people used, by the procedures they used. Some of them definitely involved dodgy research subjects. Some of them involved dodgy researchers. But most of the people involved would have been sincere and really thought they were onto something. This particular Stargate project was done in California, CIA funding it. Later on, an organisation called the DIA, which is the Defence Intelligence Agency, so if you like the defence version of CIA, and they were investigating it, but after a while, they just gave up. They just dropped it. Their data was investigated by different people, a couple in particular that's referred to in the article. One was a psychologist and statistician from University of California. Another one was a psychologist and a noted skeptic named Ray Hyman, who I've interviewed. I've spoken to him about this. The other person was Jessica Utz, but who was in favour of parapsychology. She found it promising. Whereas Ray Hyman was yet to be convinced. And naturally enough, when they looked at all the statistical information that came out of the Stargate project, they had different views. But I've seen reports about it, and I've seen investigations of it. And it was full of poor practice, like the people who were assessing the results. So someone would sit down in a lab and someone else, a researcher, would go out to a location to, say, a big tower or something, or a building or a bit of water or something, and think about it. And the person in the lab would try and sort of gauge their thoughts and be able to draw out the building or whatever that they were near. And therefore, they would come back and compare what the reality was to what the drawings were. And sometimes they was close, other times they weren't. The person judging it might have been a bit lenient, saying, well, that looks like that, etc. Like, yeah, a box looks like a bridge because there's a bit of a box down the bottom of the bridge or something like that, whatever reason. Some of them did look close. Some of them, you're bound to get some hits. They're not great hits, and some of them look totally unlike what they were. So then you get practice of the people only choosing the ones that were close and ignoring the ones that were obvious misses. The judges were people who are often the same person judging all of them, which they shouldn't have. They should have been independent people judging them, and they weren't always. People who didn't know which drawing was supposed to be with which real location. You could mix them up and say, okay, you tell me which one is which one matches up. An independent person found it a lot less accurate than a researcher who was judging it. So throughout this history of this Stargate project and other parapsychology investigations of psychics, etc., it's a bit of a history of poor practice, fraudulent practice, either on the part of the researcher or the researchee. It's sad, actually, because there was most people getting into it were very sincere about it, and they thought they had gotten onto something, but obviously the CIA and the DIA, after a while, thought, no, there's nothing here that's useful, whether there's nothing there at all, there's certainly nothing useful, and they just dropped it. So the history of parapsychology is an interesting history, going on from now more than 100 years, and we've published long articles, actually, looking at parapsychology and people taking it apart and looking at what the cases are, and it hasn't been very convincing except to the people who are parapsychologists.
In many ways, we've really got to thank the CIA for this sort of stuff, because they showed us how unscientific paranormal studies are.
And a lot of the stuff they've revealed, they've actually given us, here it is, here's the stuff we got, you find something there. So yeah, they did the job they should be doing, which is throwing money at anything, which is a bit, oh yeah, you've got that much money to throw around. Yeah, no wonder you're spending, your budget's huge. But they should look at various activities and see if there's anything worthwhile looking at. And in this particular case, Stargate project, they didn't. Not to say that Targ and Puthoff both been promoting it ever since, making a living off it, and Stanford Research Institute is still going. What it's doing now in psychic things, I don't know. But yep, it's still out there. And Uri Geller always claims that this was the laboratory that proved his skills. It wasn't. It didn't prove his psychic skills anyway. It proved his very convincing and charming skills. It's not the same thing.
That's Tim Mendham from Australian Skeptics. That's the show for now. SpaceTime is available every Monday, Wednesday and Friday through Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Pocket Casts, Spotify, Acast, Amazon Music, Bytes.com, SoundCloud, YouTube, your favourite podcast download provider, and from spacetimewithstuartgary.com. SpaceTime's also broadcast through the National Science Foundation on Science Zone Radio and on both iHeartRadio and TuneIn Radio. And you can help to support our show by visiting the SpaceTime store for a range of promotional merchandising goodies, or by becoming a SpaceTime patron, which gives you access to triple-episode commercial-free versions of the show, as well as lots of bonus audio content which doesn't go to air, access to our exclusive Facebook group, and other rewards. Just go to spacetimewithstuartgary.com for full details. And if you want more space time, please check out our blog, where you'll find all the stuff we couldn't fit in the show, as well as heaps of images, news stories, loads of videos, and things on the web I find interesting or amusing. Just go to spacetimewithstuartgary.tumblr.com. That's all one word, and that's Tumblr without the E. You can also follow us through @StuartGary on Twitter, @SpaceTimeWithStuartGary on Instagram, through our SpaceTime YouTube channel, and on Facebook, just go to facebook.com/SpaceTime with Stuart Gary.
You've been listening to SpaceTime with Stuart Gary. This has been another quality podcast production from Bytes.com.